On Wednesdays at Highland, Brian Gregory has been walking our adult class through the parables. And one of the great stories of Jesus that always comes to mind is the story of the prodigal sons. But we often call it the story of the prodigal son, singular. And yet in the story, there are two sons. And Jesus means for us to compare and to contrast them, or we miss the point. When we think about our own lives and our own mistakes and the guilt that we carry in life, if we're honest with ourselves, there's a lot there that we should be sorrowful over. The great Charlie Brown cartoon. There's a panel where Charlie Brown says, "Sometimes I lie awake at night and I ask, where have I gone wrong?" And a voice says to me, "This is going to take more than one night." Well, I think most of us, if we're very honest, that's true for us all. And yet, if God feels far away, it's not God who's moved. It is we ourselves who've done the moving. We're as close to God as we choose to be. And that's certainly true of the younger brother. There's the first act of the prodigal son's story, in which the younger brother removes himself from the presence of the father. There's a second act in which the elder brother reacts to the father's love for the first son. But we have a circumstance here where if we have two brothers and the oldest would receive an inheritance of 2/3 of the father's inheritance, and the youngest got 1/3. That would happen when the father died. And so if you're hearing Jesus' story for the first time, you would be astonished that this younger son would be asking for an inheritance while the father was still alive and to want him dead, essentially. He was really wanting for the father to be dead. He was essentially saying, I want your things, but I don't want you. I want the father's things, but I don't want the father himself. A traditional Middle Eastern man probably would have responded in only one way. He would be expected to drive the younger son out of the house by any means necessary. But this father doesn't do that. Verse 12 says he divided his property between them. He divided essentially his life, everything about his life between them. And so here's this son asking his father to tear his life apart, to tear apart his standing in the community, to tear apart really everything that he has. And this father responds by doing that. And the hearers of this story by Jesus probably had never contemplated a Middle Eastern patriarch who responded to this kind of insult with this much mercy and grace. And so what this father is doing is enduring the worst thing a human being can endure, which is rejected love. I think there are all of us, from time to time, we've understood the reality of rejected love. And sometimes we react in very poor ways. And we're sorrowful over that. Sometimes we react in ways in which we ourselves have been hurt. In Luke chapter 15, verses 16 and 17, we see what becomes of this son who has now, taken from his father. It says he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, that is when he came to his senses and realized what he actually had been doing, he began rehearsing an internal dialogue. He said, "How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, and here I am perishing with hunger?" And so in verse 18, he says, "I'll go to my father and I'll say to him," and he starts rehearsing this thing he's going to say. You ever done that before in your own life? Rehearsing, a message you were going to say to somebody that you thought was really, really important. Well, here he's doing that. In his rehearsal, this is his message. "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants." And so in other words, "Father, if you'll just take me back as a hired apprentice, maybe you teach me a craft. I know I can't be your son anymore, but at least I can begin to pay back what I owe you, what I've done for you." The incredible thing about Jesus' story is that he depicts the father as longing for this lost son. And when he sees him a far ways off, he begins to run towards this lost son, and he finds him and he embraces him, and he's showing absolute emotional abandon by hugging him and kissing him. And he says to his servants, "Get my son, his royal robe. Honor him. We're going to have a great feast for him. You're not going to earn your way back into the family. I'm bringing you back through my grace." So this is an astonishing picture that we have depicted of the Heavenly Father in the person of this father in the story. Now, when we move into Act 2 of the story, the older brother hears about the father's mercy to the younger son, and he's furious. He's particularly, I think, upset about the cost. Because, he hears about this fatted calf, a very rare and delicate and expensive animal reserved for very, great occasions. And so the father is actually dipping into the elder brother's future inheritance by sacrificing this calf. And so he may have been thinking, how dare you use your wealth like this? I've always obeyed you, and yet you're going to do this for this son who's abused you. And so verse 29, he seems to approach the father in a very deliberately insulting way. "Listen, you," almost publicly humiliating his father by not going to the great feast that his father's throwing for his younger brother. And he publicly humiliates him by refusing to call him father. But the father extends grace to the son as well. He says, "My son, I still want you in this feast. Almost every other father I know would have disowned you because of what you've just done, but I still want you in." And then the story just abruptly ends, and we're wondering what's going to happen at the end of the story. Jesus never tells the end of the story. And there's a reason for that, because this story is meant to radically challenge us in the way that we look at our faith. For one thing, Jesus redefines in this story, he redefines God as a deeply loving Father. It was Jesus himself who prayed in the garden, "Abba, Father." And here he defines what he means by Father. It's not just the privilege we have of calling God Father, but he depicts God as a father unlike any father of that time, one who's generous beyond any expectation, who throws away any kind of abandon about his status and runs to his lost son. And he's willing in the process to receive the agony of rejected love. Jesus in this story also redefines sin as rebellion and being self-righteous. We see the rebellion in the younger son. We look at that and we say, "Oh yeah, that's a very sinful thing." But there's also rebellion in the older son because he's self-righteous. Both of them are lost because the older brother is proud of his goodness. Now, the real key to understanding this story is earlier in the chapter, in the first couple of verses, where we have a very clear grouping of two groups. Verse 1 says, "Tax collectors and sinners were gathered around Jesus to hear him. And Pharisees and the teachers of the law were muttering and saying, 'This man welcomes sinners and eats with them.'" On the one hand, we have the younger brothers of the obvious sinners and tax collectors, Gentiles even, who are extended incredible grace by the Father. And on the other hand, in verse 2, we have the older brother of the Pharisees and teachers of the law who are very dissatisfied with the Father's mercy and grace because they think it devalues their own goodness. And so we have depicted here the two basic ways human beings try to make the world and themselves right. They either try to do it through self-discovery, learning who they really are, like the younger brother going off into the far country, or through self-righteousness by the perfect keeping of laws. And Jesus is in essence saying it's really the humble who are in the kingdom, and it's the proud who are left out. And so the gospel of Jesus is not moralism, and it's not relativism, Both of those are two very popular ways that people try to justify themselves in their behavior in the world and be their own saviors. But the gospel really is about people trying to get God and get back to God and to be face to face with this loving Father. And the way that we do that is through Jesus. And so Jesus shifts salvation really to getting God himself, to seeing God as the greatest of all treasures in our lives, to treasure him above all other possible rewards, to think that my greatest heavenly treasure is not a mansion over the hilltop, but it's being face to face with God himself again, and to be embraced by God who's been searching for us afar off. And so when the older brother encounters the father in Act 2 of the story, and the father says to him, everything I have is yours, that's really literally true. The younger brother could only be brought back into the family at the enormous cost and expense of the older brother. And a true older brother would have seen the agony of the father and said, Father, I'm going to go and look for my brother. And if he's ruined himself and all his inheritance, I'm going to bring him home even at my own expense. But he didn't do that. He was a bad older brother. But Jesus tells us about the bad older brother so that we would look for the right older brother, that being Jesus himself. In Jesus' name, his love is burning in our hearts like living flame.